Yo, YouTube. Like I said, let me get this motherfucker out the. God damn. God damn. Hold on one second. Technical difficulty. Technical difficulty. Hold on one second. Jesus Christ.
Dogs and Wanderers. 1917.
All right, editor, edit all of that out. You got that for me, right? Right, you gonna edit all that out. I appreciate that. You the goat, bro. You the goat. I got your. I missed your payment last time, but I got you this time. I got you this time. I promise.
1 hour later.
Yo, YouTube. We back. Today we have the history of NLH. What the fuck was I about to say? NHL. National Hockey League. I'm guessing that's what that stands for. Never been to a hockey game in my life. Never watched a hockey game in my life. Only hockey player I know is Wayne Gretzky from Everybody Hates Chris episode. And that is it. So let's find out.
In an effort to get rid of Toronto Blue Shirts owner Eddie Livingstone, the Canadiens, Senators, Bulldogs, and Wanderers would suspend the NHA, or the National Hockey Association, to create a brand new league of their own. That league would be known as the NHL. At first, it was only meant to be temporary, that is until Livingstone continued to feud with the former clubs, resulting in the NHA owners coming together to officially suspend the NHA permanently a year later, and thus the NHL was born. But that's not all. Recently, I found myself watching a lot of older NHL games, mainly from the 50s and early 60s, and I became so intrigued that I began
It's a lot of
to think,
history right
what
there.
did the NHL used to look like and be like? So for the past week, I've been researching vigorously to try and figure out the entire history of the NHL, and I wanted to share it all with you. The way this video will be formatted will be a bit different, but it will make things simpler and easier to follow. We'll be going decade by decade and summarizing the main events that took place. We'll be going
W.
through rule changes, key events, expansions, relocations, while also highlighting the star players from each decade and the Stanley Cup winners as well. We'll also look at how the game was changed playing-wise as
W.
well. This is going to be
Give me all the information.
a long video, so buckle up. I also strongly
Editor, don't you say a motherfucking thing, nigga. You see me? No. Don't say a word.
encourage anyone who lived through these decades personally to comment your thoughts or anything you want to chime in with. With that being said, let's get started. To start, we'll be including 1917 to 1919 as a part of the 1920s. So, we already mentioned how the NHL started up, but what happened during the 1920s that helped create the game we know of today? Well, we can see some monumental rules enforced right off the bat that helps explain things a bit more. The first big rule established in 1917 is that goalies are finally allowed to drop to the ice to make saves. Before, believe it or not, the goaltender would be penalized if they dropped to the ice, which seems pretty bizarre. A year
What the
later,
fuck?
assists were finally tracked, helping boost players' point totals, and kicking the puck was allowed in the neutral zone, which would be created once two lines would be painted, creating 3 playing zones. Goalies were also now allowed to pass the puck forward, and overtime was limited to 20 minutes. Before, you just kept playing with no time limit. Minor penalties used to be 3 minutes up until 1921, where they would be changed for good to 2 minutes. And in 1925, delayed penalty rules were enforced, and
Damn.
the team captains were now allowed to
1920s.
talk to the referees. A big rule was that a roster was only limited to 14 players, and you could only dress a maximum of 12 players each game. In 1927, the game would be played in 3 periods of 20-minute intervals, with the team switching ends after each period. 1928 introduced ties and a 10-minute overtime period. If no team scored,
I wonder if my black ass would have showed up to a tryout in 1928. Wonder what would have happened.
they'd be assessed with a tie. To wrap up the decade, forward passing was now permitted in all 3 zones, and so was kicking the puck. But if the puck was kicked into the goal, then the goal wouldn't count. Goalies were also forbidden to hold the puck, and if they did so, then a face-off would occur about 10 feet in front of the goal. High sticking penalties were introduced, and so what was essentially the third line, as the max players dressed increased from 12 to 15, and a rule similar to offsides would be created on December 21st of the 29-30 season. The 1920s was the foundation decade. There was a lot of building up and tearing down, and while the NHL was building new rules and regulations, new teams would appear and disappear relatively quickly. In 1917, during the NHA owner meeting, a 5th team known as the Toronto Arenas would be added, and the Quebec Bulldogs decided not to operate during the first year of play. The players on the Bulldogs roster would be distributed to the other 4 teams. On January 3rd, the infamous Montreal Arena fire would take place, burning the home of the Canadiens and Wanderers. As a result, the Wanderers would fold, leaving just 3 teams. In 1919, the Toronto Arenas would change their name to the St. Patrick's, and the Quebec franchise was finally back up and running, but it was short-lived.
Quebec.
Just a year later in 1920, the Quebec team would be sold to H.P. Thompson.
Fuck! I already gave him bad luck.
When the first U.S. team would be added, the Boston Bruins would join the NHL, and just 2 years later, a franchise would be granted to both Pittsburgh and New York. A second Montreal team would be added as well, as the Maroons would try to fill the void the Wanderers left behind. The Tigers didn't stay long, as they go on strike in 1924 and then drop out of the league a year later. And in 1926, Chicago, Detroit, and a second
Blackhawks
team would join.
Wakanda.
The league would now feature 10 teams. The St. Patrick's would become the Maple Leafs, and the league would create 2 divisions, the Canadian Division and the American Division. And this would be the norm. For now anyways. When the league started, the NHL played what's called a split schedule, meaning the team with the better record during the first half of play would face off against the team with the better record during the second half to see who would ultimately win and face off for the Stanley Cup. At first, the teams would play 22 games, but soon it would increase to 24 before completely being abandoned in 1921. Afterwards, the first and second place teams would instead face off, and the winner would challenge for the Cup, meaning teams from the WHL and PCHA could also challenge for the Cup. A common challenger in the early 20s would be the Vancouver Millionaires, but they'd always fall short. A total of 6 NHL teams would win the Stanley Cup. The Senators would win 4, the Arenas/St. Patrick's would win 2, both Montreal teams would win 1, and the Bruins and Rangers won a cup as well. I emphasized NHL teams and challenged, as actually a team from the WCHL actually won the Cup in 1925, as the Victoria Cougars defeated the Canadiens. And finally, to close the 1920s, some of the first stars were Joe Phantom Malone, who scored 7 goals in 1 game against the Arenas, Howie Morenz of the Canadiens, Cecil Babe Dye, and Francis King Clancy. Clancy and Vesna had such an impact on the game of hockey that they have awards named after them even as of today. And also a fun fact, Clancy is the only player to have ever played every single position. Yes, even goaltender. And to close out the 1920s, we have to talk about perhaps the most monumental thing that happened in the NHL. In 1920,
NHL got history for real.
It would make the first official broadcast of an NHL game. All games are broadcasted to Toronto's radio station, helping the NHL get further on the map. The 1930s would introduce even more rule changes that would help build upon the foundation of the NHL. In 1930, if a player's stick were to break on the ice, the NHL instituted the rule we know of today, where they can retrieve a stick from the bench and continue the play on. For whatever reason, in 1931, a rule was created clarifying that only one goalie can play on the ice. And I don't know who needed that reminder, as there's no official record of any team trying to play 2 goaltenders at once. In 1932, all captains...
Yeah, I can imagine that. I found a loophole in the system, Jimmy. What if we just put 2 goaltenders in front of the goal? There's no rule book that says it. We can't do that. We'll be champions. You're a genius, Smithens. You're a genius.
To be on the ice at all times, which must have been hard for the captains, as now they essentially...
God, the damn head of board was like, yeah, don't do that. let's nip that in the bud before they actually do that.
had to play the entire game. Also, when a goalie took a penalty back then, the actual goalie served the penalty, so coaches had to substitute the goalie with a new one. Visible time clocks had to be a part of every rink, and now 2 referees had to be on the ice at all times rather than 1. In 1934, teams would be awarded a penalty shot if a player gets tripped on a clear scoring chance, and then 3 years later, they decided to also reward a penalty shot if any player besides the goaltender fell on the puck. A year after that, in 1938, players were allowed to skate in before shooting the puck on the penalty shot, and instead of 2 referees, 1 ref and 1 linesman would be on the ice. And that's about all that changed. Regulations wise, the clubs in the NHL continued to come and go and change over. In 1930, the Pittsburgh Pirates moved to Philly for a season before ultimately folding a year later. Also in 1930, the Ottawa Senators would take a, quote, brief hiatus from the NHL. They later returned in 1932 before relocating to St. Louis in 1934, becoming the St. Louis Eagles. And the final change in 1930 was when the Detroit Cougars became the Detroit Falcons. In 1935, the Eagles would fold, and in 1937, the Montreal Maroons would withdraw from the NHL, dropping the league down to 7 teams. And this would stay the same up until the 1940s, which we'll talk about later, as 7 would soon become 6, forming what we know of today as the original 6. The
original 6
was still about improving the game as a whole. Also, keep in mind that the Great Depression was perhaps a big reason as to why most of the 10 NHL teams either relocated or folded. We don't really see an impact in on-ice play up until the 1940s, however, which only happens due to another uncontrollable situation. But nevertheless, some significant events still took place in the 1930s.
Nobody died?
The NHL would hold its first All-Star game in 1933 as more of a charity game for the injured Ace Bailey. Bailey being hurt due to the infamous Eddie Shore incident, in which a dirty hit changed Ace's life forever. The trade deadline will be introduced in 1931, and it was set to be on February 15th of every year. Every original 6 team was able to capture the Stanley Cup, including the Montreal Maroons in 1935. And the 1930s saw some old stars continuing to dominate while new talents emerged. Charlie Conacher mainly headlines the 30s as he'd win back-to-back Art Ross trophies and would average 1.2 points per game throughout the decade. Sweeney Schreiner is another back-to-back Ross Trophy winner and was a star on the Americans. Also, the 30s saw the arrival of the infamous Toe Blake, the emergence of Ace Bailey, and the grittiness of Eddie Shore. More than half the names I just mentioned played for the Maple Leafs at the time, so just imagine how the 1940s would go for these star-stacked Leafs.
Damn, Toronto was turned.
The 1940s was
Toronto was turned
by World War II. In fact, the entire league almost completely shut down. A ton of NHLers enlisted in the war, making the talent level of the league dwindle. It actually was so bad that at one point, players who looked like they should be playing 2 more years of juniors were playing in NHL games. But the league decided to stay intact, and this was after Charles Sawyer, an American lawyer, insisted that the league stay up and running as it could boost the morale of both countries. Countries being Canada and the US, of course. As more players enlisted, service teams were actually formed. The line,
they probably wasn't making money, so he probably was telling the truth.
Play for a RCAF team, while in the US, a team in Curtis Bay would feature future Hall of Famers Art Calder and Frank Brimsick. Despite the drop in talent, the fans didn't seem to mind, and believe it or not, attendance improved during the war. One of the rules in place during this time,
damn, they was making money.
Overtime would be demolished until further notice, basically until the war was over. And after the war, clubs were permitted to dress 17 skaters, a goal would be awarded when a thrown stick prevents a player from scoring a goal, and the penalty shot would continue to be tinkered with throughout the late 40s. Also in 1943, the NHL would create and establish the hockey.
So you can't block a shot by throwing the puck, by throwing your stick? Not the puck. Why the fuck did I say the puck? I hope the puck is the black thing that be sliding around that you score with. I hope that's what that is. But your hockey stick, you can't throw that bitch? What? That seemed like a high IQ play. I think you'd have some crazy moments. Oh my God! He threw the stick before it could go on the goal. That'd be hype, man. That'd get me hype. Missing out on great opportunities.
Back then would be referred to as the International Hockey Hall of Fame. Now, remember when we mentioned those Toronto Maple Leafs earlier? Well, the 1940s, mainly post-World War II, would be dominated by the Maple Leafs, as they were a team that was able to face the adversity head-on. The Leafs would win a total of 5 Stanley Cups during the decade, and would win 3 consecutively, becoming the first NHL team to ever win 3 in a row. Now, unlike the Leafs, other teams struggled post-World War II, as those players who were once wicked fast and crafty with the puck would eventually lose their touch due to the war. A prime example of this is the New York Rangers, as after winning the Cup in 1940, they'd failed to even qualify for the playoffs for the next 5 seasons. And when the war was taking place, the Rangers were so desperate for talent that they'd have 42-year-old Frank Boucher come out of retirement to play 15 games. Despite the war affecting a good amount of talent throughout the league, the 40s
Ain't no way, bruh.
icons that would eventually tear up the 50s and beyond. The first...
I wonder what that knock on the door was like. Hey, Frank. How's the wife? How's the kids? Oldest in college yet? Listen, man. I got a nickel and $20 in my pocket. We need you. I don't care about the arthritis. You're our star. 40-year-old man, bro. You better let him retire, bro.
Maurice Rocket Richard.
Let that man sip on his margaritas.
Talent who could score at seemingly any angle. They called him Rocket due to his rocket speed and shot. He simply couldn't be stopped. Both he and Toe Blake would form the infamous punchline that would tear up the 40s. Also on that Montreal team was Bill Durnan, who was perhaps the best goaltender of the decade. The All-American Chicago Blackhawks would feature star players Doug Bentley and Walter Babe Pratt, who would hop around the league during the 40s, but was still the best shutdown defenseman in the league. And finally, another big name of the decade was the final piece to that punchline in Elmer Latch. Latch, Richard, and Blake would eventually help Montreal win 2 Stanley Cups during the decade. Other champions included Boston in 1941, Detroit in 1943, and of course the Rangers in 1940. This would be their last Stanley Cup until, well, we'll get to that later. Wait, pause. Wrong decade. No, actually, I'd be correct. In 1952, the man himself, Foster Hewitt, would broadcast the first ever hockey night in Canada as he called the action between the Maple Leafs and
We hit TV!
And right away,
We made it!
Became a hit, becoming the highest rated show in Canada. But believe it or not, this show also caused some concern. Some,
What?
including Commissioner Campbell, feared that broadcasting the game would cause more people to sit at home instead of in the stands. But Conn Smythe felt the opposite.
What the fuck?
On CBS in 1956 would
That man was not hip.
games in the US, and it was a great success, and the NHL began to adapt itself. In 1949, they made the puck easier to track on screen, and they even painted the ice surface white. In 1951, to better determine which team was which, the league made the home teams wear colored jerseys and the road team wear white. The 1950s in the NHL followed the same trend of becoming more revolutionary.
TV made them, forced them to improve the
memorable moments. A big moment
the aesthetic.
that really broke barriers was in 1958 when, as an injury call-up, Willie O'Ree would become the first African-American player in the NHL.
Oh!
2 games with the Bruins.
My nigga! We made it! Yes, sir! Yes, sir! We made it! Only took us what? 20s? 30s? 40s? What's that, 10? 20? I can't count. 3, 4, 5, like 3 years, 30 years. We made it. They had a whole team called the Black Africans. What the fuck? Why it take us so long? But we made it. We here.
Season, but would play an additional 43 games in 1960. Although his career stat line is only 4 goals in 45 games,
That's
it was
okay.
his impact he left on the game of
That's
hockey
okay.
that earned him the label of the Jackie Robinson of hockey. Another crucially cultural moment took place in 1955, and this is perhaps the biggest event to take place in the 50s, as it sent shockwaves throughout the league. In March of 1955, the beloved beloved Rocket Richard would be suspended for the remainder of the season, including the playoffs, after receiving a penalty for slashing Hal LaCoy and then punching a linesman who was trying to break up the fight. But the problem was that LaCoy instigated the fight and didn't receive any discipline at all. This didn't go well with Montreal fans and French Canadians, as they accused Campbell of anti-French bias. Campbell would be warned not to attend a game in Montreal after receiving death threats, but he refused to listen, and thus the dubbed Richard Riot began. Campbell would be booed and pelted with eggs and fruit, while outside of the Montreal Forum, fans were met by a mob of angry demonstrators. Over 250 police officers had to arrive onto the scene, and over 70 arrests were made. 37 people were injured during the riot, and 50 stores were looted.
They was riding or dying for that shit. They was riding or dying. They said, like, you come into my town, and you disrespect my people.
Not so bad that Richard himself had to go on the radio the next day to tell the rioters to stop the chaos. He said he would serve his punishment and then promised he'd win a Stanley Cup. And a year later in 1956, he did just that. This riot was more than just about defending Richard, however, as many like to think of this riot as the coming together of French Quebec and Eastern Canada, as back then the two had a pretty large gap formed between them. And speaking of gaps, two particular NHL teams had a pretty big gap in terms of talent amongst the rest. The first being Richard's Canadiens, as the names on the roster speaks for themselves. The 1950 Habs featured Jean Beliveau, Doug Harvey, Jacques Plante, and Bernie Boom Boom Geoffrion. Geoffrion got his nickname Boom Boom due to his powerful slap shot, a shot in which he claimed he came up with as a kid, and Jacques Plante is credited for being the first goaltender to have ever worn a mask. The second star-stacked team was the mighty Detroit Red Wings, led by Ted Lindsay, Terry Sawchuk, Alex Delvecchio, and some guy named Gordie Howe. Gordie Howe was an extremely talented and gifted player. He earned the nickname Mr. Hockey as the man
Mr. Hockey.
He could score, set up plays, deliver bone-crushing checks, and could pack a mean punch. Howe would win 5 Art Rosses and 5 Hart trophies, and even had his own hat
Are Art Rice's MVP trophies, I'm guessing?
trick called the Gordie Howe hat trick, when a player scores a goal trophies, and even had his own hat
5
trick
Hart
called the
trophies?
Gordie Howe hat trick.
There's a lot of trophies, a lot of awards. I need to know what they are, though. I don't know what they are. I wasn't really listening, I guess.
Richard and Belliveau's Canadiens would dominate the decade.
He probably
The Wings
explained
would
them.
win 4 Stanley Cups, and the Habs would win 5. 4 out of those 5 being consecutively from 1956 to 59. The Wings and Habs would face off against one another in the Stanley Cup final 4 times. The Wings having the upper hand, winning 3 out of the 4 matchups, further proving just how dominant both clubs were. Oh, and the Maple Leafs would also take home a Stanley Cup in 1951. Up until now, the league still remained a league of 6. Each team had their own star player, and things were
I thought it was 7.
around the year.
What the fuck?
NHL and the
Somebody
CFL
left?
expanded both geographically and globally. As to start the decade off, the NHL would agree to construct the Hockey Hall of Fame on C&E ground. The hall would open up on August 26th in 1961, and 3 years later, player developmental leagues would open up as well. Also, the first ever amateur draft would take place. The prospects had to have been 17 or older to be eligible to be drafted, but the number would change throughout the decade from 17 to 18 to the eventual 20 the league would mandate in 1967. 1967 was a special year for the NHL all around, however, as the league would be doubled in size. We mentioned how this decade was about expanding and evolving. Well, 6 new sports markets were about to receive an NHL franchise. The clubs would be located in Minnesota, California, Los Angeles, and 3 familiar places in St. Louis, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. The NHL would welcome these teams by putting them in a, well, interesting division. The Kings, Seals, North Stars, Penguins, Flyers, and Blues would be placed in the same division known as the West Division, while the original 6 teams would be placed in their own division called the East Division. These new divisions would also mess up the playoff format as well, as now the Stanley Cup Finals would consist of an original 6 team and an expansion team every single year. This would be extremely unfair for the new teams, as they'd be low on talent. Nobody expected any new team to even compete for a title right off the bat, but one team would surprise everyone. The St. Louis Blues would be the team representing the West Division every year from 1968 to 1970, and, well, as you'd expect, they didn't win anything. In fact, after making the Stanley Cup final 3 years in a row, they didn't even win a single game. That's just disheartening. Another disheartening event was when the Maple Leafs would enjoy their final decade of dominance. The Leafs would win 3 straight Stanley Cups from 1962 to 1964, this time led by Red Kelly, Frank Mahovlich, Dave Keon, Tim Horton, and Johnny Bower. The Leafs would enjoy their final Stanley Cup victory in the dreaded 1967 season, and since then, the Leafs have yet to make it back to the final. The stars of the 1960s would soon also become icons of the 70s. Bobby the Golden Jet and Stan Mikita made up the Blackhawks of the 60s, and the Bruins would have their own star come the late 60s with the arrival of Bobby Orr. John Beliveau and Gordie Howe would still make their mark on the decade, but the great Maurice Rocket Richard would hang up his skates during 1960, signaling a new era of NHL hockey, an era so grand that it revolutionized the game for years to come.
The 60s.
The 70s would continue to expand and evolve, both with the arrival of new teams that would change up the divisions and players that would ultimately change the style of play. In 1970, the NHL would add 2 new teams in the Vancouver Canucks and the Buffalo Sabres. Because of this, Chicago would move to the West Division and the Oakland Seals changed their name
Not
to
Wakanda.
the California Golden Seals.
They can't take us out of our home. That's where we've been.
It was a good time to expand the playoff format. Now, the first place team would play the fourth place team, while second played third. In 1972, the Atlanta Flames and the New York Islanders joined the league, and 3 years later, in 1975, the Kansas City Scouts and Washington Capitals followed suit. The newly named California Golden Seals didn't have their new name for long, as they'd relocate to become the Cleveland Barons, and just 2 years after joining the NHL, the Kansas City Scouts would become the Colorado Rockies, and 2 years after the Barons arrived, they'd merge with the North Stars in 1978, making the league a league of 17 teams.
Damn.
It was until 1979 where 4 unique teams would enter the league, but how they entered was a story of its own. For this, we need to go back to September 13th, 1971, when Dennis Murphy and Gary Davidson founded the WHA. The WHA was an attempt to bring hockey to markets in which the NHL failed to reach. The ultimate goal was to compete with the NHL, and the way they would do so seemed really smart. At first,
What?
WHA would challenge the NHL reserve clause, which allowed players greater freedom to go where they choose. This resulted in 67 total NHL players shifting to the WHA. They
Damn.
would also make an effort to sign European players as well. And at first, some of the names coming in were some mere depth players, but after Bernie Perron, Jacques Plante, and Dave Keon joined, they seemed to be more legit. However, it was when they managed to bring in both Gordie Howe and Bobby Hull that made the NHL realize they had some legit competition. The
Jesus.
WHA would entice Hull to join by paying him a king's ransom, and in fact, most of the players that came in from the NHL also received a lot of money, and because of this, as the years went on, teams were struggling to pay their players, and the league failed to bring in revenue, so much so that when the Whalers won the first Avco World Trophy, they had to hoist the Conference Championship trophy, as the WHA didn't have a trophy ready yet. Wow. To summarize, the WHA would begin to lose teams at a drop of a hat, and in 1979, they'd finally agreed to a merger with the NHL, bringing in those 4 new teams. Those teams ended up being the Edmonton Oilers, Quebec Nordiques, Winnipeg Jets, and New England Whalers, which actually had
Damn.
the name.
That sounds just like the WNBA. What the fuck is wrong with you? The NBA and the ABA. The ABA had a play style of dunking and a lot of flashiness, and the NBA at the time was just kind of boring. And pass the ball before you shoot, and get your shot off, and look at the ball when you dribble. Get your shot off, while Dr. J in the fucking NBA was over here flying over niggas and dunking the ball. Like it was a foul in the NBA at the time, and they had great I think they had good revenue coming in, but not a lot, not enough as much as the NBA, because it was more professional and it was slowly dying. And just like basically the exact same scenario, the NBA saw what they were doing and were like, it's working. What they're doing is working. So we're just gonna merge and take their rules and keep the name.
To Hartford Whalers.
I wonder if the people in ABA, or in the what did he say? WHL, whatever. You know, if they got paid a good amount for the merger, I wonder. I hope they did.
Boston wanted to represent. The 1970s
$1 million companies now.
introduced the role of the goon, and we talked about this in our Downfall of the NHL Enforcers video. Basically, one day the Flyers decided they were tired of getting pushed around, and so they built their team up to become rough and tough, and eventually, after winning back-to-back cups in 1974 and 75, teams wanted to copy the Flyers to try to build a tough team of their own. Soon, in order to survive on the ice, you had to not only be smart with the puck, but you had to also fight to earn your keep. And because of this, these goons became household names just like your everyday stars. Terry the Tasmanian Devil O'Reilly, Willie Plett, Paul Holmgren, and perhaps the most memorable enforcer, Dave the Hammer Schultz, became icons due to their grittiness and wit. While these enforcers were packing a punch, other noticeable stars were shining bright and making just as significant as an impact. The biggest star of the 70s...
Throwing haymakers, bruh. Throwing straight hands, bruh. I fuck with it. I ain't gonna lie. I fuck with it.
Icons due to their
Huss, 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 huss. Ooh, I fuck with it. I fuck with it.
The biggest star of the 70s was Bobby Orr, as the guy could do it all. He was fast, crafty, and could do it all at every end of the ice. After his iconic cup-clinching goal in 1970, Bobby Orr would win 5 straight Norris trophies, tally 659 points, and would take home 2 Hearts and 1 Art Ross trophy, further resembling just how talented
what are Hearts?
He was.
Ross. I'm guessing the Ross trophy has to be the MVP.
He was another speedster who would skate
has to be
effortlessly and shock the fans almost every night. He would become the first player to ever have 10 straight 50-goal, 100-point seasons, and his impact in Montreal would help the team win 4 Stanley Cups. This would be the last time Montreal would be a dynasty, and Lafleur was a big reason as to why they were so successful. And so was Ken Dryden, whose absurd 6 Stanley Cups and 5 Vezina trophies makes him one of the best goaltenders of all time. In an era in which goal scoring was at a crazy number, Dryden made it look easy, so much so that he would retire early as he felt he had nothing left to prove. In other words, he got bored of being good. Other stars included the great Bobby Clark, the wicked smart Phil Esposito, Marcel Dion, Gilbert Perreault, Brad Park, and Larry Robinson.
Larry Robinson.
These names are great, but none are as great as the one player who would absolutely tear up the 1980s, shredding up NHL records and franchises along the way.
Wayne Gretzky?
So remember when the WHA merged with the NHL? Well, what we failed to mention was that one of those players that happened to be on the Edmonton Oilers was a young Wayne Gretzky.
I was right!
And the Oilers, with their first ever NHL pick, would select defenseman Kevin Lowe.
Never seen this man a day in my life. Let's see what's the hype about.
Edmonton team that would soon tear up the NHL. But before we talk about Edmonton, we have to talk about the game itself, as hockey in the 80s was pretty entertaining to watch. If you liked goal scoring, that is, because goaltending in the 80s was god awful, unless you were Patrick Waugh, Billy Smith, or Grant Fuhr, that is. And this led to a lot of lopsided games and tons of scoring. The decade would be mainly dominated by 2 players, Mario Lemieux and Wayne Gretzky. And although Super Mario didn't enter the league until the second half of the decade, both stars would put up insane stat lines while taking home numerous scoring records along the way. Then there was Mike Bossy, who also seemed to be in a league of his own. His goal scoring abilities would help his star-stacked Islanders dominate the early 80s, winning 4 straight Stanley Cups. Players like Dennis Savard were able to spin around opponents and create more space, and even defensemen like Ray Bourque and Paul Coffey were getting quicker and also scoring at insane rates. Back then, it was actually common to see players score 100 plus points every year. It was insane in the 80s, and not to mention, while all this was happening, fighting would still become a major part of 80s hockey. In fact, you could expect at least 3 fights a night with new names like Bob Probert, Dave Tiger Williams, and Clark Gillies. But perhaps the biggest and most memorable fight was the Good Friday Massacre between the rival Montreal Canadiens and Quebec Nordiques. This fight would be, and still is, the go-to when talking about just how much of a tire fire fighting was in the 80s. The 80s was also about pride, and one game in particular changed the way hockey would be viewed.
Man,
in the US. The decade would actually
if I didn't have a bad knee, bro.
helping the US once again.
If I didn't have a bad knee,
that we would begin to see more and more Americans.
I ain't trying to play.
Within the next
I just want to throw hands.
Also see the arrival of some European players as well. The Stastny brothers and Bord Salming set the foundation when defecting into the NHL. The Stastny brothers' impact on Quebec was crucial for the team's short stint of success in the early 80s. In fact, many actually forget that before Mario came around, Peter Stastny was the one giving Wayne a run for his money. Soon, we would see more and more Europeans enter the league, but mainly in the 1990s. There was little to no movement by NHL clubs in the 80s. In fact, only two major moves took place. At the start of the decade, the Atlanta Flames, my favorite hockey team, became the Calgary Flames, winning a Stanley Cup in '89. And the only other noticeable move was when the Colorado Rockies would move to New Jersey, becoming the New Jersey Devils. Some major rule changes also happened at the start of the decade. When players were now permitted to wear helmets, Craig McTavish became the final player to have ever sported, or I guess to have not sported, a helmet. And speaking of McTavish, this brings us back to those Edmonton Oilers, as after the Islanders' 4-year run, the Oilers would become the next team to take the league by storm. The core by 1985 now featured Yari Curry, Paul Coffey, Gary Anderson, Grant Fuhr, Craig McTavish, Mark Messier, Kevin Lowe, and of course, this team looked like every 11-year-old's dream Hockey Ultimate Team lineup, as they would take over the second half of the decade by winning
Dream Team
cups of their own, but not consecutively. They were so good that many people actually believe they too won 4 straight. But in 1986, the Bob Gainey Canadiens would cut their dynasty in half. The 80s was also about style. The goalie pads exploded in size, goalie style of play got more advanced when the butterfly was introduced, and jerseys were allowed to have different color palettes. All in all, the 80s were insane, and mostly dominated by 2 teams. But when we get into the 90s, things get even better. Sergei Fedorov, Pavel Bure, Nicholas Lidstrom, Jaromir Jagr, Alexander McGillney, and Teemu Selanne. These players would be a part of the European invasion that took place in the 1990s. Europeans would become all the buzz after the Nordiques would draft Mats Sundin first overall, and Hakan Lube would produce a 100-point season. Soon after, we'd see more and more players come from Europe who would eventually dominate at the NHL level. The 90s was a perfect time to be a hockey fan, with the old stars of the 1980s being combined with the new stars of the 90s. The league's abundance of talent was at an all-time high. Most teams each had their own stars as well. The Nordiques had Sakic and Sundin before relocating to Colorado, where the Avalanche would have Sakic and a guy named Peter Forsberg. The Golden Jets' son Brett Hull would become a star after being traded to St. Louis. The Red Wings would become a powerhouse with Steve Yzerman, Brandon Shanahan, and the Russian Five. And the Flyers would acquire the next big superstar in the mighty Eric Lindros. The Devils would also have a team of stars with Marty Brodeur in the crease and the hard-hitting Scott Stevens. But with this team, they'd utilize a strategy called the neutral zone trap that would make the game go from a fast-paced, high-scoring, fun-to-watch shit show to a slow, dull, and boring game. This strategy would be great for the teams that used it, as those who did would reap the benefits and hoist the cup for most of the decade, including the Devils. The Red Wings would win a pair of cups back-to-back, and so would the Penguins led by Super Mario. The Oilers would win another cup in 1990, and the Rangers would break their cup drought, winning with Mark Messier in 1994. Now, 2 other teams would win the cup as well, the North Stars and the Nordiques, but they were now known as the Dallas Stars and the Colorado Avalanche. Also, the Hartford Whalers would relocate to Raleigh to become the Carolina Hurricanes. This trend in new identities led to even more teams entering the league throughout the decade. The Sharks,
How many teams were there now?
Predators, Mighty Ducks, Panthers, Thrashers, Blue Jackets, and Wild would enter the league all throughout the 90s, being known
Chicago Blackhawks, Wakanda.
Southern expansion. Now, having hockey in California seems absurd, right? Well, not anymore.
Or Nightwolf.
Failed to mention that in 1980,
I guess they are Indian.
Great One would actually get traded. His trade to the LA Kings helped put the Kings and hockey on the map in California. Hockey became increasingly popular in the southern states, and the NHL would take huge advantage of the Wayne hype. Just like that, the league will be a league of 30 teams. All in all, hockey in the 90s was the perfect version of the league. The goaltending got better with the Dominator, Marty, the Eagle, and Patrick Waugh, and the on-ice play still included brutal fights and hard-hitting players. The entertainment value was great, and hockey was still mainstream at the time. I made a video about hockey in the 90s, so I took your guys' comments and suggestions and tried my best to put in a lot of stuff that I missed last time. Now, on to the 2000s.
Hey.
The 2000s was
Y2K.
a new era of the NHL, an era in which the league would begin to shift into the modern NHL we know of today. But back in 2000, the dead puck era seemed to still be in its prime, and the league was very, lenient on hooking and holding. The role of the enforcer began to become less and less valued. After the Bertuzzi incident and the McSorley incident, people began to wonder if the role of goon should even be a part of the game. The early half of the 2000s are stained by the 04-05 lockout, a lockout that would change the game into what we know it as today. To give a brief summary, back in 2004, 76% of most teams' revenue was spent on player salary, as this was because, at the time, the NHL didn't have a salary cap. The league's collective bargaining agreement also expired, so the league would shut down up until July 13th, when both sides would compromise, and the league would be the final of the Big Four leagues to adopt a salary cap. They would also now abolish ties and replace them with the shootout. The shootout guaranteed that there would no longer be any ties, but to this day, fans argue that the shootout eventually ruined the game, amongst other things as well. The league would also create new rules, such as eliminating the two-line pass, creating a trapezoid behind the net, preventing the goaltender from playing the puck too far out of his crease, and now if you ice the puck, you had to keep the same guys on the ice. These new rules, along with several others, allowed the game to become faster and quicker paced. The second half of the 2000s saw the emergence of brand new talents. Sidney Crosby and Alex Ovechkin would become the brightest faces of the NHL, and guys such as Jerome McGinley, Joe Thornton, Pavel Datsyuk, Ilya Kovalchuk, Danny Heatley, Evgeny Malkin, and Daniel Alfredson would also leave their mark on the decade. As expected, the early 2000s saw the Avs, Wings, and Devils continue to dominate, but afterwards, teams like the Lightning, Hurricanes, and Ducks would take home a Stanley Cup, and so would the Chicago Blackhawks in the 09-10 season, ending a drought of their own. But they wouldn't stop there, as the 2010s would be dominated by one man, Patrick Kane. When Kane was drafted first overall, it signified a turning of the new leaf. Kane was smaller than most first overall picks, but his talent was undeniably good, and he was extremely fast and agile. When Kane was selected, it really let everyone know where the league was headed to next. Scouts were no longer concerned about how big, heavy, and tall a player was, but rather how skilled, crafty, and swift they were. The NHL of the 2010s became a quick-paced, fast, and fun league to watch. Games were also entertaining once again, as granted players and teams weren't scoring
Capitals
6 points a game,
hometown,
they were wickedly talented and super speedy. Not to mention goaltending was at one of its best, with the emergence of Henrik Lundqvist, Carey Price, Jonathan Quick, and Corey Crawford. Only one major move would happen team-wise. Well, two actually, as one, the Atlanta Thrashers would relocate to become the new Winnipeg Jets, and then in 2017, the NHL would expand to Las Vegas, bringing in the Golden Knights. The star power was once again at an all-time high. Sidney Crosby remained the face
How many
of the
fucking
NHL
teams are in the
until
NHL?
2015, when the Oilers would draft the
Jesus Christ, bro. There's too many names to
would
remember.
immediately take off.
My ADHD can't handle it.
The fastest skaters the league's ever seen, and his combination of speed and puck handling reminded everyone of a new age Pavel Bure. Soon, we'd see Nathan MacKinnon, Austin Matthews, Alexander Barkov, David Pastrnak, Nikita Kucherov, and others begin to light up the league with their agility and scoring touch. But back to Chicago.
They moving with that bitch, I ain't gonna lie.
The early 2010s
They is moving with that
dominated
bitch.
by the Blackhawks. Kane, Taze, Keith,
Hus, 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 hus. I see him. I see the movement.
That would win 3 Stanley Cups in a span of 6 years. But they weren't the only dominant team that decade either, as Crosby's Penguins would win back-to-back cups in 2016 and 17, making them the last team to go back-to-back since, ironically, the Pittsburgh Penguins in 91 and 92. The Kings would tear up the early 2010s as well, becoming the first 8 seed to ever win a Stanley Cup, and teams like the St. Louis Blues and Washington Capitals finally fought the Demons to win a Stanley Cup. The NHL was all about tackling contact with the head, as the worry of CTE grew larger and larger. Also, overtime was changed to a 3-on-3 format, video reviews would be overhauled, and the league was also focused on goaltender interference, which is still a major question to this day. The NHL of the 2010s is what I and many modern NHL fans grew up on. This is where our current video stops.
Huh?
There is still a lot of moments and players we didn't even get to touch up on, such as the Summit Series in 1972, Mike Milbury's shoe fiasco, McSorley's illegal stick, the great scoring race of the 92-93 season that was the last true year of offensive dominance, the Brett Hull foot in the crease controversy, the 2004 Jelena controversy, and so much more. But as we enter a new decade of hockey, so much more can change. Whether it be a minor or major impact is still yet to be determined. As of now, the league is continuing to expand, with Seattle on the way, and perhaps Houston
No
as
way.
well. And with
No
what's going on in the
way.
world
There's
right
more
now,
teams.
Maybe these projected new divisions become.
Oh my god.
This video going on
What?
in the world right now, maybe these.
It's 8 in every column. 1, 2, 3. It's 8. There's 7 in that one. 8 is 20. You take that 6, you put it into 8. 8, 9, turn into 34, 14, 34 plus 7, 50s in that bit, right? So it's 50 teams. Yeah, let me just count these bitches. 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. What the fuck was I counting?
These projected new divisions become the norm. This video took forever to type out, and I spent a ton of time researching and finding as many sources as I could to make this the best video possible. I also, yes, went back and watched a ton of old film trying to understand how some of these guys' names were pronounced. I appreciate all the support y'all have shown me, so my Christmas present to you guys is a video that I hope was worth your while. The end goal was to make this video like a history book, and I hope you guys learned a little
It was a
something
W.
today. Happy holidays.
That was a W. Honestly, NHL base. It's where they were required to. Around 70% of players were already wearing them. By the time this rule came into effect, players already permitted to wear them. Long before 1979, motherfuckers just didn't give a fuck. Nigga, if I box in my sport, you think I give a fuck about a helmet? Nigga, I'm ready to die on the field. Yeah, how dare you? I remember, okay, this is about the 2 goalies. So about the 2 goalies rule, I remember reading a story in a hockey book a few years ago about a team in the early days, 10s, 30s, that actually took a player off the ice and put another goalie in net. But both goalies couldn't coordinate properly and let in 14 goals or something like that. And then the league banned teams. What? What? But both goalies couldn't coordinate properly and let in 14 goals. What? So they failed. If that's true, that's hilarious, bro. They fucking failed at their attempt. That's fucking hilarious. I'm gonna end it right there. Hockey. For my take, before I watched this video, my initial take on hockey was that there's boxing in it. I know that there was fighting. It's an aggressive sport, and Canada. That's all I knew. That, and I knew that the Capitals won a championship 2020. I think they won it. I think they won it in 2020. I think they did. Maybe 2021, around that time. And Wayne Gretzky from Everybody Hates Chris. That's all I knew. Now I see that. Now that I see some footage, hey, y'all be moving. Y'all be moving. I see the movement. Huss, the stick movement. I see y'all get saucy with that little thing. Y'all get saucy. I like what I'm seeing. Let me know if y'all want me to react to some more. Show me your favorite players. Maybe they got a highlight reel or any other video you've checked out yourself that you might want me to learn on, and I'll check it out. Without further ado, I'm gonna see y'all in the next one. I don't have an outro. I just say bye.